Welcome to the fourth session of Apex at Home. My name is Salim Hlayel. I am a Principal Product Manager for the Oracle Application Express in the Middle East. I am based in the beautiful city, Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates. Our speaker for this session is Philipp Salvisberg, and he's going to be talking about using the PL SQL Debugger. Philipp is a Senior Principal Consultant at Trivadis. He's a developer, and he's interested in everything to use the database as efficiently as possible. Before Philipp starts, I would like to remind you to provide your feedback 10 minutes before the session ends, and you have 10 minutes after the session. Philipp, you may start.
Okay, hello everybody. So my name is Philipp, and as almost everything has been said about me, just want to add that I'm really a developer. I do a lot of development with PL SQL and SQL, but also with Java. And for me, it's really important that we run the stuff on the right place. So when it's efficient to run the code in the database, I try everything to run it there. Maybe you know me from my free SQL developer extensions, and you use one of them. I'd be happy if I hear from you when you do so. So let's get started. So the agenda for today is the following. I'd like to do some introduction into the topic, and afterwards I prepared 2 demos for the PL SQL debugger. One demo is running the debugger from SQL developer directly. I run the code there and I debug it there. I call this kind of classical debugging of PL SQL. And the next step is another demo I prepared is debugging in Apex application. There we are using remote debugging feature, and actually both debugging methods are remote debugging, but in this case we are running an application from a web interface and call the debugger from there. So that's a bit more challenging and more interesting. So the motivation for this speak, why I'm doing this talk, and it's not that new. Because I was last year at the Apex World in Rotterdam, and I heard this talk from Peter Agonic. It's a quite good talk, and you should listen to it, and you really have the chance to, because at 3 p.m. UTC, he will present this talk again. I guess more or less the same content. I really can recommend that you watch it. So, but why did I do my talk? So I realized that people are thinking about different things when they hear the word debugging. And I especially think also about different things. And I thought I could do a talk about it and maybe change it a bit. So the question is, what are you thinking of when you hear the word debugging? There are several options I've prepared. There are more, but maybe it's one of them. So are you thinking about explaining code line by line to yourself to understand why things does not work? So this is rubber duck debugging. You use a rubber duck like that because it doesn't look that silly when you talk to a rubber duck than when you start to talk to yourself. So the thing is, you can use also a colleague and explain the code line by line, because it happens more often than not that while you explain the problem, the colleague still has questions to ask. You find the problem, the solution to the problem yourself. So that's one method. So maybe you think about that one when you hear debugging. But maybe you think about also change the log level, because you have really good instrumentation in your application. You just have to change it, the log level, and get more information like we've seen before. Change it to log level 9 and you get a lot of information about the sequels which have been executed, how long they took, and so you get an idea where the problem is. So maybe when you hear the word debugging, you think about changing the log level. But maybe you're another type of person, and when you think of debugging, you say, oh, okay, I should have done some instrumentation, but I have some, but it's not complete enough. So let's start to and add some ad hoc instrumentation into the code to find out what the problem is. I show here the classical thing we all do from time to time. We all tell, hey, you shouldn't do that, but we all do it. We all do it. We have to admit it, and we don't like it because we have some issue with it. We have to remove the code afterwards. We cannot really process something like a club here, DBMS output, while I write it here in SQL double quote. I say, oh, damn, this is a club. This does not work when the content is too long, and so on. But that happens. If you use another logging framework, it might be easier. But that's maybe what you think of when you hear the word debugging. But maybe you're, again, another type of person, and when you hear the word debugging, you think about testing. You think, oh, I use testing, I use UTPL SQL, so I explore the code using PL SQL, I define what I expect, I get my actual, and then I go into the code and find out what it does. That's what I see as debugging. So debugging is also testing for me. So everything I said here is not really wrong. It's just what you think first when you hear the debugging. But maybe you're again another type of person, and when you hear the word debugging, you think about setting a breakpoint in the debugger. And I have to admit, I'm that type of person, and that's really basically also the reason why I have this talk, because I'd like to have more people think about debugging the PL SQL debugger when they hear the word debugging. So what I see here is really, really interesting when I call the debugger. I see on the left side the stack where it was called. I see it's a test I'm debugging here, and I see the whole PL SQL, UTPL SQL stack. So I can learn a lot about the UTPL SQL itself, UTPL SQL framework itself. When I look at that stack, explore the variables there, I can see every variable which is defined there. I don't have to think about everything when I log it. So I just have the context of an execution of a program at a certain point in time. So that's also debugging. And as I said, I'd like to think more of you to use the debugger and think about using it, because what I face in real life is that it's not that easy anymore to use it. And a lot of developer complaints that, yeah, I know it, but I can't use it in my environment. So I want to explain in this talk what you can do and how you can make it run in your environment, and why you should start using the PL SQL debugger. So that was the motivation. So a lot of talk, already spent 8 minutes and nothing really interesting. So the next topic is the fundamentals, because before I start demo it, I have to explain how DBMS debug works. It's a rough overview, so not really in detail, but still you have to understand the fundamentals. So the first option we actually had it since version 8, I think, the package DBMS debug. It is deprecated since version 12.2, so it means it's deprecated, it's still there, it's not decommissioned, and I don't think it will be inside the developer. That's me or you. And on the right side, we have the database where the code is stored. I want to debug. So what I establish is two things. The first is I establish a database session. So a database session means over SQLnet to the database. This session is called a target session. This session is running your code you want to execute in debug mode. So allows you to stop it, explore variables, and so on. And This is a second session, also a session connected to the database via SQL.NET. It's called the supervising session. It connects to the target session to talk to it. So when this is started in debug mode, this session can say, I'd like to attach to this session, and then we talk to each other, say, hey, show me this variable, show me what variables you have, go to the next line, and so on and so forth. So that's the classical debugging, how this works. So why is it deprecated? Because this approach has some disadvantages in terms of the capability. So what is not possible with this approach is to debug Java stored procedure, for example. So big deal who has Java stored procedures nowadays. But it was back then when version 9 came out, then everyone would like to have Java stored procedures in the database. And the other thing is what's not possible, you cannot debug PL SQL and Java stored procedures at the same time within the same session. This is possible with another method. And last but not least, what does not work, you cannot debug code which is executed, for example, via an Apex application. That's remote debugging, and that's nowadays still relevant and stays relevant, and that's really a hard limitation for DBMS debug. So let's look at the other option, that's DBMS debug, JDWP. That stands for Java Debug Via Protocol. It's really based on Java. It's a Java protocol, and it's available since a long time. So this works completely different. Not completely, but really different. So the first step is identical. I have here the client side. I may connect from SQL Developer, but I may also connect from a browser which is running an application on an application server, which is calling words, and words is connecting to the database and executing some code, and then I want to debug that. So this is the first session, somehow established via SQL.NET, but not necessarily directly. And then, and that's the big change, and then we have the database which is calling the client. So SQL Developer, for example, in that case. And for that, this is not going via SQL.NET. This is a TCP/IP low level. I don't know even what the protocol is behind, but it opens a TCP/IP-based connection here, and here the SQL developer has to listen on a certain point, and then they can exchange commandos like, say, I'd like to be interested in variables of that line. Let's go to the next line, and so on and so forth. So that's fundamentally different, and this introduces some issues because we heard Andrea before how she talked about that it's difficult to get certain permissions, and when you here have a shared database in large companies, and you're going to them and say, hey, I'd like to have open ports here to my personal desktop computer to enable debugging, you probably get some strange looks. So this is really difficult to get, but even on shared databases for development purposes, there should be a way, I really think. And if you are a developer which has the possibility to run a database locally, it's no problem at all, because it can give you all the privileges you need. So the next slide is basically a comparison to show what are the pros and cons of these two approaches. And what is interesting I'd like to show here is that SQL Developer supports both methods. It's a myth that it does not support that anymore. It's really hidden. They don't advertise it, but I show you afterwards how it works, that you can enable it and that you even can run the debugger old style in a shared development environment. Okay, so we see here the disadvantage. What's also interesting is to mention is that remote debugging is only possible through SQL Developer. It's also possible through JDeveloper, but it's not possible through Toad or PL/SQL Developer from all-round automations. Does not work. So you really have, for the fancy stuff, you have to use SQL Developer. Good. What are the prerequisites when I want to run it? So what do I really need exactly? And this sounds a bit boring, but really it's important, because when you do not follow these rules, you don't get any debugging experience at all. So they're really important stuff here. So the first thing you have to do is to compile for debug. Makes somehow sense. The code must have some additional information so that the debug can get them. So to do that, you set it on session level. It's also possible to set it on database level without a system, but I don't think it's really necessary. Important to mention is also there is an old setting that is called PL/SQL debug, and it's not a hassle that it is deprecated. It's really from the old times where PL/SQL debug was a Boolean value. It was true or false. And true or false is nowadays not enough, because we have 4 levels, and that's the reason why this parameter is deprecated. So if you want to use the full range of optimization level, I have to use this parameter. So 0 is basically compatibility mode of version 9 and older. 1 allows you to debug. Number 2 does some additional optimizations like inlining code. And you can see that inlining code can be a problem when you want to debug and the line is not there anymore. So it's important for that also that you put it on level 1. There's also a level 3, which does some more aggressive optimizations. You don't get really a lot of documentation what this means, but in the end, the expectation is that to make your code run faster. So here's an example how you could recompile your code if you want to recompile your whole schema. It helps you to get information about the whole stack, but it's not really necessary that you compile everything. The more you compile in debug mode, the better the debugging experience is. So that's step 1. That's clear. That's not too complicated. I can set this option also in SQL Developer. In SQL Developer, there's preferences with the optimization level, and you set it to the one you like. But when you do that there, you have to keep in mind that it's applied on every new session you open for all connections. So if you easily open a production database and change there some code because you need it, and you know you shouldn't, but you do it still, then it will be compiled with optimization level 1, and that may have an impact on your performance or may not. So be aware when you set it here. I do it here, but I do not deploy stuff from production with SQL Developer, so it's not a problem for me. So the next important thing is that you have to allow a session to connect to a debugger. And this you can do on several ways. You can grant it to you for your own sessions. So this does not work out of the box. You have to grant it to yourself. That one option, which is probably good enough when you just work with one user without the connection user, something like that, without the connection pool and so on, then this is enough. But usually you have to use something else where you enable debug any connection. That's what I use in my development environment to enable to establish a debug session for every user I can connect. There's also an option to be a bit more restrictive to really manage that. That's maybe an interesting idea if you want to enable debugging on a shared development database. But in reality, that's what you need. And the next thing is really, really important is you have to say the database, hey, the other one may see my code. So otherwise, it's not possible to set the breakpoint. You won't get it's possible to set a breakpoint, but it will be ignored. And it's not possible to explore variables. So if you don't set this, it feels like the debugger doesn't work. So it's really very important. I saw a lot of questions about debugging is not working, and usually this one is missing. So you have to grant it. Typically, again, the lower one is grant everything. Procedure is a bit misleading, but in fact, it grants the access rights to all objects which contains PL SQL. Here you have a more complete list. That's procedure, function, package, type, also the body, of course, and view triggers and table triggers. So, and the last thing you need is you have to enable enable the database to communicate over the network to SQL developer. So you have to set this RCA. There's no way around it. It's a hassle. We have to open it. This is the simplest way is you can do it on a development environment is to say host a star, and here you list the target users you would like to debug the code for. So that's it. It's a lot of things you have to prepare to make the debugger work, but it's necessary. So let's look at an example. I prepared the first use case, the simple one, and simple ones are always based on depth and depth. And here I do a query on depth. I get these four rows. I think you know them by heart in the meantime. And what I highlighted here is New York. New York is is the location of department 10. So what I want to do is to update it. I change the location to Zurich, and I expect, of course, that this update works. But surprisingly, it does not, because what I have here, it's still New York. So that's strange. I can start talking with my rubber duck to find out what the problem is, or I may do some investigation on the database side. So that's what we are going to do. So I switch here to SQL Developer. I hope you see that. And what I prepared here is I just do the query as before from the depth table, and I get these 4 rows. Everything good. So the next thing is I try this update. Maybe it works here. It does not work on PowerPoint, but maybe it works here. No, it's really bad. I change it to Zurich, but it stays New York. So not good. But in reality, what I do when one case does not work, I try another one. Maybe it's working with department 20. So let's try that. Clear that and try it with department 20. Look here, I change it to Dallas in lowercase, so it seems to work. I roll back everything. So it works for department 20, but it does not work for department 10. So I have some basic instrumentation in that table API I'm using. So I'm going to enable that and say I'd like to have trace enabled here and change it again and see what I get. So the same as before, nothing changed for department 10, but I get some additional debugging output. So what is interesting is 2 things. First, there goes a lot of time between this step and this step. It's almost half a second which I spent. And the second thing is it's just 0 rows update. So there's obviously something wrong, but I don't have more information in this log. I know how long it takes, but I don't have more information. So now comes the time when I think about debugging, to enable debugging. So I added here the statement I need for this session. So when I assume I don't have anything defined for doing debugging here with a newest package of Oracle, I do need two things. I have to grant connect section to my user, and I have to enable the communication over the network. I do that. That's also a neat trick I learned recently, that it is possible to use a connect within a worksheet in SQL Developer. That's neat. So now I'm ready to debug my session, but first of all, I'd like to show you two things. Optimizer. I'd like to show you that I've set the optimization level to 1. So everything I compile is in debugging mode. And I like to show you some debugging settings you can set. There's a lot of things. I do not have really time to go into everything, but here are some important settings. So you have basically two options. You can say, hey, run my code until I have set the breakpoint. But if you don't have set the breakpoint, it behaves like no debugging is enabled at all. So if I don't set the breakpoint, I typically choose step into. This is a bit less aggressive. Here you see really the full stack and really step by step on every level. So I do that. So I go here, I have an anonymous block. I do my update here as I've done before and like to debug it. And I say debug. My host is my SQL dev host. And voila, the debugger is started. So what I get here is interesting thing, the stack. It starts really with an anonymous block where I have the update, and I have here some information to what are the set breakpoints, what are my variables. There is nothing here. What are all my data, and I can also set some watches, means variables I'm typically interested in. So what I do here, I step into it. I go to the update statement. So maybe you say update, how can I debug that? That works only, of course, if there is a trigger behind. In this case, this is a view and there is a, instead of trigger behind, so I can debug that. And we see that easily. I can go back and forth and navigate in this stack and show me the variables. What I now see is something interesting. There are now certain variables identified in this trigger based on this declare section, even if I have not started it yet, and they are not initialized. So let's go through, step through it. The first thing I'm going to initialize is my start time. And while I'm doing this, I think, oh my God, that it's probably not such a good idea to store the sys timestamp in a local variable, because when I'm doing debugging or the processing is going a long time, this is not really the right time I'm storing here. So I learned something while I jump through this code. I continue to jump through this code here. That's initialization of an object type. Then the constructor is called. I see it here in the stack. Jump through, it is initialized. I'm back here on my trigger. And now I'm not so interested in jumping through. I just go next step, and I see how these variables below will be initialized. I populate the new row. So we have the accounting and the location. I see, okay, the population here, so far so good. So the problem must occur somewhere later. I could continue to debug. I see here, okay, it's updating, that's really true. And I have information here also. I can hover over this information and get this information about the location here as well. It's helpful when you have a lot of variables down there to have this as an alternative. So we see here that's Zurich. So let's step into it. What does this API do? And that's interesting again. So I'm stepping through the package specification here. That's with some definitions, and that's also interesting because I have a constant here which has a value of null, and a constant value that cannot be changed, but it has to be set somehow. And I see that it will be set here step by step, like a variable. Afterward, it's immutable, but there is a short time where it is mutable. Okay, I continue to debug, and the next thing I'm jumping into the package body. Again, some initialization here, and maybe also in the body below, but there is no initialization. That was my first call of this package body in this session. Therefore, some initialization happens here also. So now finally I go to this step where something seems to happen. I do some print line here, I jump over it, I get the new row. This is more be an interesting one. I see still Zurich, it's still good. And I jump over here and I see that will be the IO record, so input output. And here, this is this record which still has Zurich. So what happens when I jump over? Is set to New York. So here something happens which is wrong. Unfortunately, I cannot go back, but in this case, I say, I identified something like that. I continue to run it, close this session, and close that as well, and start debugging it again. In this case, I don't go step by step, I just run to the breakpoint, and now I know, okay, I want to explore it in detail. Here, jump through, and now later sleep, that's why we lose some time, and then I set hard-coded the value to New York. That's why it's not working. So, but just for curiosity, I set here an additional breakpoint because I want to show you something else. So I jump to this breakpoint, and I see some interesting data here. That's the iterator I. So if I large loop, I'm not interested to step through until I get to the value of 1011. I want to have a bit more control. So what I can do here is I say, okay, stop here when the value is 10 because we are changing the value 10. So, and then I can just continue. And the next time it stops after 10 iterations, and I can go further, and I see, okay, New York is changing the value, and that's it. So this is basically debugging in PL SQL Developer. Okay, good. So I mentioned that it is possible to enable DBMS debug in SQL Developer. I don't show it live because I need the remote debugging capabilities for my second demo, but I show you how you can change it. It's 2 slides and you can easily apply it after this session in your environment. The first thing you have to do is really easy. You just have to close SQL Developer. Why you have to do that? It's because SQL Developer stores some configuration files in memory, and you have to ensure that it writes it down. Otherwise, you maybe change some configuration files, and then you close SQL Developer and your changes are lost. So this is an easy step. The next step is a bit harder. You have to find the right directory of your system directory where SQL Developer stores a property file named ID properties. The good thing is about SQL Developer is that you can query these values in the About dialog. So you can enter here in the About dialog IDE system, and on macOS I get the path something like that. There's a version number, so it's in my personal directory. And when I do it on Windows, it looks a bit different. It's in the roaming directory, there in another directory. And there I find, in this directory, I find an ID properties file. I open it in an editor, and I just add this line. This disables the Java debug wire protocol, and therefore enables the deprecated old functionality, and it's not necessary anymore to open any ports from the database for a debugging session. Okay, so next topic is debugging in an Apex application. What do you need there? So here I need some additional privileges, as I said before, otherwise it won't be possible to debug it. For one privilege, you get an error message. That's always helpful because an error message means, oh, there's something went wrong. So you have to set the debug connect privilege for the Apex public user. The next one is a bit harder to figure out because you don't get any error messages. It just happened what I said before. You are not allowed to set breakpoints. You're not allowed to view variables. So all your breakpoints are, which you have set, are ignored by the session, and it looks like the debugging is not working at all. So these two things are very much important. And then the next thing I thought you could do is, Andrea also showed it, how you enable debugging while you do things. Normally you have here yes and no shown here when you toggle on this option, and you can change it to level 1 and level 9 and other levels between, not all, but most of them. And an undocumented option is to define here remote. And this theoretically should open you a connection to your local machine on port 4000. But this is not working for two reasons. One reason I show you on the next slide, because Oracle has no chance to find it out from the database what's your IP address. And the next problem is one about the parsing schema. If somebody has managed to make this work in an environment, I'm very interested to hear that. So the next slide shows you the scenario, how the debugging session works. I have here a Chrome browser where I run my application, and this Chrome browser establishes a session through Docker. That Docker runs on a Mac not natively. It runs really in a hidden, let's say, in a hidden VM. So it runs through Docker Desktop, then within my container through orts in my database. And here there would be the code which asks, hey, what is my remote address? And said, oh, okay, I'm this one, so that must be my caller here. And he thinks this address is actually that one where the browser is open. So therefore, it does not work in a setup like this, where you have a stacked virtual environment. So that's one reason it does not work. But when you provide the information, hey, which host do I need to connect? Which ports do I need to connect? And basically, if I want to debug or not, if you have these three information, then you may establish a connection at will and without changing the code. What SQL Debugger does additionally, and that's really, really sad, it establishes a helper session with an additional SQLnet connection to the database. Feature-wise, it's possible to do everything over this section. session, over this TCP IP session. You can ask, hey, query the data of this table, and you will get the data which has been changed but not yet committed. This is not possible here. So it's really sad that they've chosen the easy way and implemented the helper session. PL SQL Developer does that better. So what I need as next is I have to make SQL Developer ready and listen to remote debugging calls. So there's an option on the connection node, somewhere they have to put it, it doesn't really matter where, and say remote debug. And this will open you a pop-up dialog where you can say, I want to listen on ports that way, and my local address is SQL Dev. And then it waits and listens to the calls. And to establish a connection from Apex, I have, in fact, to call this this function here. It's SQL Dev 4000, and then it will connect to SQL Developer. Nice. Let's look at it in real life. So hopefully I get my cursor. Here it is. Let's check the session still here. That's the wrong one. I want to show it here and show my code. That's an additional processing I placed here, where I just say enable this connect to this port. And what I also checking is if they get an error and I'm not listening, I'm just ignoring it. So what I can do now is just change it to something else. Say apply changes. What happens? It will be ignored. So that's not what I want. I want really to do some changes. And for that, I have to go back to SQL Developer, enable debugging. On SQL Dev, and now it is listening. So I can go back to my Apex application and say, okay, let's change that value, apply it here. And what happens here jumps from left to right. You see waiting for localhost at the bottom. So that's the time when I can go back to SQL Developer, and I see a wonderful process stack here. So what would be really nice if Apex would not have been wrapped and would have been compiled with debugging mode, I would be able to explore any of these packages and the variable content, and it gives me a lot of information. So basically I can do the same. I still have my breakpoint here. I can jump to the code which does the problem and do the debugging. So from now on, it's basically the same thing. That was my demo. I'm running out of time, and I'm coming to the core messages. So maybe you get the impression that PL SQL Debugger needs to be used for everything. That's certainly not true. That's not the message of this talk. You really should instrument your code, and you should use a major framework like Apex Debug or even better Logger, which can also enable Apex Debug in the background and also choose wisely set default logging levels so that you may change them for a running application and get more information for a particular problem. Because when you instrument code, you can narrow down where you need to set the breakpoint. Because when you have a real life application, there's a lot of code, and jumping to every line is really cumbersome work. It's not very fun, even if you learn a thing. So instrumentation is very, very helpful also when you want to use the PL SQL Debugger. And the next thing, I just have a guest here, which is which said something very interesting about debugging. It's Elliot Alderson, played by Rami Malek. I think you all know the show Mr. Robot. That's from episode 3 of the first season, when he's waking up in the hospital, and let's hear what he says.
Most coders think debugging software is about fixing a mistake, but that's bullshit. Debugging is actually all about finding the bug, about understanding why the bug was there to begin with, about knowing that its existence was no accident.
So, what can I say more? The PL/SQL debugger really helps you find the bugs and understand the code. Remember the call stack. Remember that you can explore every level and the variables there, and to jump through and even change some of these values. It has some restrictions, especially when you compare it to the debugger we are used to in the Java environments. But it's still a very good tool, and I really recommend you to set it up in your environment, to play around it, so that you are ready when you really need it. So that's it. 45 minutes, a bit more. I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Philipp. Perfect timing. Well, I have a question here, which I think you covered almost in the presentation. What are the ways of debugging in Oracle Apex tool?
Yes, also the ways of debugging with PL/SQL debugger, I showed it. You have currently to call it yourself. I think it should be possible to an Apex developer, and I hope some plugin developer are listening here, to provide a plugin which does the magic behind the scenes for us.
Yeah, I agree. And let me add to that, since Oracle Apex is a web development platform, there is the client-side aspect of having JavaScript. And you, as a developer, you might want to get familiar with debugging functionalities and console behaviors of your browser. Hitting F12 will help. You probably need to read about that as well and get more familiar. And also, you can always use the debug link in Apex environment itself to see how it's behaving. And we have 9 different levels of debugging for the Apex application.
Exactly. So debugging in the last context was showing the log. You have a logging framework, and you can log there and get very detailed information and query them. It's really, really good. I can recommend that. And the other thing you mentioned is of course the browser development stuff. And then you have to debug JavaScript part there too. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Great. I have actually a question for you, Philipp. I don't know, during your history of working with debugging, which you think is the part that confuses the new developer in the beginning? You know, like somebody who wants to learn. What do you advise?
Yeah, I advise to start it up in your personal environment and just debug a very small package and see how it works. Start debugging directly from PL/SQL, from SQL developer, before you start using remote debugging. And what also really is a problem in real life are these multi-threading things. I have a simple scenario with a single-threaded application, but when there goes 20 threads and I have to debug something like that becomes a bit more complicated. So my recommendation is start simple in your personal environment and get familiar there.
Great. What are the things that's another question also from me. What are the things that you would love to see in the future when it comes to debugging PL/SQL and debugging all Apex in general, the features that you wish that they are there?
So as I mentioned, I'd like to have a native support for remote debugging in Apex. And I'd love to see debugging features enabled in the cloud, because in the cloud it doesn't work.
Yeah, great.